Can you believe that there are places on this planet where the air itself is not air, but a weapon? Where civilization clings to the edge of existence, eternally battered by a primordial ocean that cares nothing for human life or memory. We are talking about the Faroe Islands, a scattering of emerald teeth ripping through the North Atlantic, a place so remote that time itself seems to have forgotten the calendar. These are the northern sagas brought to life, a landscape forged in volcanic fury and sculpted by gales so vicious they can strip paint from a ship in minutes. But even here, in 1930, where every day was a fight for survival, the inhabitants thought they knew the rules of the game. They believed they understood the savage rhythm of the wind and the stone. They were catastrophically wrong. What happened on the night of October 23rd was not merely a storm. It was an act of geological malice, a catastrophe no one saw coming, designed to erase a civilization forged over 1,000 years. Imagine a village. Let's call it Kvívík, a tiny huddle of turf-roofed houses nestled into a fjord on the island of Streymoy. Life was simple, brutal, and dependent entirely on the bounty of the cold Black Sea. The men were fishermen, their hands calloused and hardened against the endless brine, their eyes permanently squinted against the salt spray. The women were weavers of wool and keepers of the flame, ensuring that the tiny spark of human warmth did not extinguish in the overwhelming cold. Their existence was a testament to impossible endurance. It was the smell that changed everything. Not the usual scent of salt and dried fish, but a metallic, almost electric odor that settled over the land like a shroud, making the air thick and painful to draw into the lungs. The sheep, usually stoic climbers of the impossibly steep cliffs, began bleating incessantly, ignoring the finest grazing lands, crowding together in tight, nervous packs, facing inland as if fleeing a visible horror on the horizon. Even the birds refused to fly. The old ones, the true keepers of the island's lore, those whose bones were cold repositories of ancient warnings, exchanged grim glances across the peat fires. They spoke in low, guttural Faroese, phrases thick with fatalism. Tíðin komin. The time has come. But even their darkest prophecies whispered around sputtering oil lamps. While the wind howled outside, could not prepare them for the scale of the destruction that was about to unfold. This wasn't just a low-pressure system rolling in, the kind that steals nets and delays fishing trips. This was the atmosphere deciding to tear itself apart, reaching depths of despair previously unknown, and the Faroe Islands were directly in the crosshairs of the planetary rage. The barometer, that crucial, life-saving oracle of the North Atlantic, was plunging faster than anyone alive had ever witnessed, shattering all previous records into dust. The wind started not as a gust, but as a sustained, deep sonic boom, rattling the very foundations of the salt cliffs upon which the village was precariously balanced. It was the sound of 1,000 freight trains passing through a hollow tunnel, a sound designed to steal your breath and paralyze your will before the physical destruction even began. Then came the fire, but not the fire of lightning or combustion. This fire was the sea itself. Waves, mountains of dark, furious water, taller than any house in Kvívík, began marching toward the shore, topped with a strange, bioluminescent foam, glowing with a ghastly, cold blue light that illuminated the impending devastation. The villagers, running headlong for the desperate safety of the sturdy, stone-built church on the highest knoll, watched in pure, unadulterated terror as the waves climbed the cliffs, reaching heights previously thought physically impossible, defying gravity and logic. The ocean was not merely rising, it was actively attacking. It was a hungry beast seeking to reclaim the land that had been stolen from it by audacious Vikings a millennium earlier. The fishermen who had spent their entire lives reading the water knew instantly the monstrous identity of their assailant. This was the legendary Riddarin, the rider, the rogue wave that ancient tales warned would consume the land whole and leave nothing but salt-scoured rock behind. They saw their entire fleet, their lifeline, their history, their future, their ancestral inheritance, snapped like brittle driftwood and pulverized against the unrelenting stone of the fjord wall. All in the span of 30 agonizing seconds that seemed to stretch into eternity. The world dissolved into a chaos of unbelievable sound, the horrifying crack of ancient timber, the agonizing shriek of stone rubbing against stone, as the very cliff face started to erode, and the desperate, fading cries of those caught outside the temporary shelter of the church. The air pressure difference between the epicenter of the storm and the relatively sheltered fjord was so vast, so unnatural, that windows didn't just break, they exploded outward, turning sharp shards of glass into deadly shrapnel that flew through the night like vengeful silver insects. Inside the church, huddled together beneath the thick protective stone vaulting, they prayed not for rescue, for they knew no ship could possibly reach them through that maelstrom, but for a quick end to the suffering, or perhaps just for the walls to hold for 5 more minutes. They listened, paralyzed by the sheer terror of nature unleashed, as the roof tiles, heavy slates mined from the earth itself and weighing dozens of pounds, were peeled back and hurled into the darkness by an invisible, monstrous hand, the sound echoing like cannon fire. This was not merely the loss of property or livelihood. This was the brutal, violent severing of the link between man and his ancestral home. The stone, the very bedrock they trusted to anchor their lives, was vibrating, singing a terrible, low-frequency song of total destruction. We are about to dive into the untold, terrifying history of this legendary event. The night the Faroe Islands almost disappeared beneath the waves, and the extraordinary, almost unbelievable struggle of a few hundred souls against the overwhelming, lethal power of the North Atlantic fury. Get ready, because this story starts where most nightmares end. The fire on the cold ocean nights was their signal flare of despair, a terrifying illumination that marked the beginning of their most grueling test. The wind was only just getting started.
The wind didn't just howl. It screamed, a high-pitched, metallic shriek that vibrated the very stones of the islands, tearing at the fabric of reality itself. It was a sound that didn't come merely from the air, but from the depths of the ocean floor, dragged upward by some ancient subterranean malice determined to strip the world bare. The pressure was a physical entity, a massive, monstrous hand pressing down on the ancient turf roofs, threatening to flatten the entire village into a grotesque, muddy pancake of splinters and despair.
This wasn't merely weather. This was a geological force manifesting as air movement, registering speeds that no instrument in Tórshavn, hundreds of miles distant, could possibly comprehend, let alone record without melting down entirely. The small, rugged settlement, clinging precariously to the unforgiving basalt cliffside, was now simply an unfortunate target, a minuscule sacrifice offered to the insatiable, frozen hunger of the North Atlantic. They were locked irrevocably in a cage of tempest, the key tossed casually into the deepest, churning abyss.
Their small, indispensable fjordinger and slightly larger sexadinger, the traditional 6- and 8-oared vessels that were their very lifeline, represented their only tangible connection to the vital fishing grounds and, crucially, to any remote possibility of rescue, however impossible that seemed in this apocalyptic moment. They had already dragged them far above the normal, historic high water mark, chaining them with heavy, brutal iron moorings to the massive, moss-covered boulders that had stood sentinel for millennia.
But the waves, the colossal, terrifying liquid mountains, were refusing to obey the measured, predictable historical tidelines. They were aggressively reinventing the coastline with every terrifying, earth-shaking crash. These liquid giants, now towering visibly taller than any humble house in the village, were launching spray and foam that traveled hundreds of feet inland, carrying pebbles and jagged sea debris like deadly high-velocity shrapnel meant for surgical demolition. The men fought the iron mooring lines with every ounce of reserves they possessed, their muscles screaming in protest as they wrestled against the ocean's brutal, relentless suction and the wind's tearing malice, knowing that one catastrophic slip meant instant, agonizing drag into the freezing, watery grave below. Inside the low-slung, grass-roofed homes, the fight was equally desperate, a silent, internal war against structural collapse and creeping cold that threatened to steal their breath away.
The thick, sodden layers of turf, meant only to provide simple insulation and reliable stability against routine seasonal gales, were now rapidly becoming dangerous liabilities, utterly saturated with driving rain and shaking violently under the sustained, destructive aerodynamic lift of the wind's relentless fury. Every single creak of the roof timbers sounded like the final, agonizing groan of a dying giant, signaling imminent collapse and the end of all hope.
The women worked feverishly, their hands raw and blistered, piling heavy stones,
The ancient, weathered basalt ballast they usually employed for internal stability during long sea voyages, onto the rafters inside the small, claustrophobic living rooms, desperately trying to anchor their meager sanctuary against the hurricane's sheer, tearing power. They were literally holding the roof over their children's terrified heads, using nothing but sheer human will and brute, terrified force against the overwhelming, indifferent elements.
Meanwhile, the central hearth, the last flickering hope of warmth and light, the sacred fire motif, was fighting a losing battle against the vicious, downward-sucking drafts screaming down the chimney flue. Smoke was being violently sucked back down, filling the cramped breathing space with a choking, acrid haze, rapidly turning their only refuge into a potential inescapable tomb where they might suffocate before the storm could crush them. This geographical isolation, which had for centuries been their rugged, natural shield against the outside world's corruption, was now morphing into their merciless executioner. The Faroe Islands, already merely a tiny cluster of basaltic specks in the terrifying vast expanse of the North Atlantic, offered no refuge whatsoever from this sheer magnitude of environmental fury. They were pure volcanic rock, sheer vertical cliffs rising straight out of the water, offering no gentle, protective beaches or sheltered harbors large enough to absorb this continental shock wave. To the east lay the impossible distance to Norway. To the west, the emptiness stretching to the permanent ice of Greenland. They were truly, utterly alone, surrounded on all sides by the churning, freezing blackness of water that promised instant hypothermia and absolute oblivion within minutes. The grim, paralyzing realization settled over them like a thick, freezing shroud of mist. No radio call would ever penetrate this elemental barrier, and no help would arrive until long after the disaster had finished its precise, devastating work. Their fate was now sealed within the narrow confines of their small, exposed bay, protected only by the desperate, frantic prayers whispered into the deafening wind and the incredible, stubborn resilience forged by generations of unparalleled hardship on this cold, dark rock. They were praying not for the storm to miraculously stop, but only for their fragile wooden buildings to hold on for just one more terrifying second, one more grueling, unbearable existence. Then came the dreadful, unique sound that momentarily cut through the roaring, deafening wind, a sound of immense, grinding, inescapable finality, unlike the roar of the sea. It wasn't the sound of the ocean's violence, but the sound of the land itself giving way, the bedrock fracturing under pressure. The basalt cliffs directly above the village weakened relentlessly by days of continuous, torrential rain, and the seismic, bone-jarring pounding of the gargantuan waves had finally, irrevocably fractured under the strain. A catastrophic shower of stones, ranging from small, skull-crushing pebbles to colossal boulders the size of fully grown sheep, began to cascade down the steep, slick slopes directly toward the northernmost houses, gaining lethal velocity with every foot. The stone had officially joined the battle, not as a metaphor for Faroese strength and permanence,
but as a weapon of sheer, pulverizing, unadulterated destruction. This was the moment of complete, unmanageable terror that surpassed even the storm's fury. The elder Pole shouted a warning, his voice shredded and useless against the gale, pointing desperately toward the accelerating debris field, as the first house was instantly pulverized, compressed into splinters and dust. He knew that the wind could strip a man naked and the sea could drown him, but only the falling stone could instantly obliterate their entire civilization, crushing everything beneath it into oblivion and bloody ruin. The battle had escalated violently from a desperate defense to a pure, panicked, hopeless evasion.
The wave didn't just break, it consumed. It wasn't water hitting wood, but a liquid anvil striking a matchbox, reducing every structure to unrecognizable, sodden kindling. The roaring vacuum left behind was almost worse than the initial impact, sucking air, faith, and the very foundation stones out into the screaming abyss of the fjord.
Jens, the young fisherman, felt the ground vanish beneath his hobnailed boots. The path he had walked since he was a boy, the solid, immutable path carved into the side of the cliff, was gone, ripped away by the ocean's hungry, unforgiving maw. He scrambled wildly, his lungs burning with the icy salt spray, realizing that the vertical world of the Faroe Islands had suddenly become flat, slick, and fatally unstable.
The wind, that invisible, bone-shattering architect of doom, did more than just push, it dismantled. As the sea retreated for its next colossal, heart-stopping run, a sharp, terrible sound echoed over the primal chaos, the shattering of the windows of the assembly house, the great Bygdarhus.
Inside, where the elders had gathered their precious few oil lamps, the pressurized air blast accompanying the structural breach turned the fragile light source into a secondary catastrophe. A plume of flame, impossibly bright against the slate-gray darkness, erupted from the wreckage. Fire, on the ocean, in the middle of the most devastating, freezing flood the North Atlantic had ever conjured.
It was the ultimate sick joke played by the elements to introduce heat, the element of comfort and survival, purely as a tool of annihilation. The sight galvanized the remaining villagers. They weren't just fighting the drowning, freezing cold anymore. They were fighting a blazing inferno, fueled by gale-force winds that turned small sparks into roaring, sentient beasts of consumption. The elder, Kari, a man whose face was etched with the maps of 1,000 North Sea storms, barked orders that cut through the shriek of the wind like shattered glass. Up to the Fjallagota, the high path. The sea will not reach the high sheepfolds. But the route was treacherous, a ribbon of icy rock ascending steeply above the burning settlement. Every handhold was slick with frozen spray, and the earth beneath them was actively convulsing, shifting stone plates loosened by the perpetual hydraulic assault of the waves. It was no longer a path. It was a vertical challenge against gravity, time, and inevitable doom. The most vulnerable were the children, bundled tight and carried on the backs of the strongest men, their small cries swallowed whole by the wind's monstrous howl. Every single step was a calculation of fatal risk. Slip here, and you don't just fall. You tumble hundreds of feet into a churning, fiery grave of water and oil. It was in this desperate upward scramble that they saw the true, horrifying scale of the rogue wave's reach. Up where the fragile grass met the bare, eternal rock, where only the hardiest mountain sheep dared graze, lay debris, splintered masts, fishing nets tangled with shattered furniture, and, most horrifyingly, a massive piece of the valley's millstone, the grinding stone, ripped clean from the floor below. The water had been strong enough to weaponize stone. The millstone, an object of immense weight and symbolic permanence, lying stranded upon the highest reachable plateau, was a chilling testament to the supernatural power of the ocean's malice. It was irrefutable proof that the elemental forces had rewritten the laws of physics, turning the defensive shield of the land into the very ammunition of their complete destruction.
The air temperature plummeted further, a sudden, sharp, lethal drop. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of deep, internal freeze that steals movement and logic, replacing them with a dull, creeping surrender. The human body, already pushed past its limits by exertion and terror, began to shut down, prioritizing core functions over the luxury of movement or thought.
One of the elderly women, Ragna, stumbled, not from a slip, but from the sudden, profound, total exhaustion that hit like a physical blow to the heart. Her daughter, Elina, tried desperately to haul her upright, but the wind immediately leveraged Ragna's dying weight against Elina, threatening to drag them both off the razor-thin ledge and into oblivion. The dilemma was brutal, primal, and instant. Save the group or save the individual. Kari appeared beside them, his eyes blazing with a horrifying, necessary decisiveness. He knew the answer the brutal islands had always demanded. Survival was communal, and weakness, however tragic, could not be tolerated if it meant the end of the entire bloodline.
With a wrenching, gut-punishing groan of sound and spirit, Kari forced Elina to release her mother's grip. It was not abandonment, but a brutal, visceral sacrifice offered to the demanding, bloodthirsty gods of the North Sea. Ragna, with a final, heartbreaking gasp of understanding, closed her eyes as the tempest embraced her, sweeping her instantly into the swirling darkness below. The price of their ascent was now irrevocably measured in kin. They continued upward, carrying that silent, terrible weight of necessary betrayal and fear. But the elevation offered only a temporary, agonizing respite. The storm, having already utterly destroyed the valley, seemed now intent on carving the very island down to sea level, erasing its existence from the map of the world.
The sound now shifted dramatically. It was no longer the crashing thunder of waves, but a deep, subterranean rumble, a noise that spoke not of water, but of the bedrock itself, tearing apart under unimaginable stress. The wind, saturated with pulverized stone dust, lashed their faces, blurring the distinction between air and earth. They realized, with a shared, gut-chilling horror that froze the blood in their veins, that the storm had breached the island's defenses not just horizontally, but vertically. Water was infiltrating the fissures and crevices carved by centuries of tectonic stress, turning the stable mountain into a ticking geological time bomb ready to explode into the sea. Every minute the pressure mounted. The cold was a physical, malevolent thing, wrapping around their exposed skin like bands of freezing metal, stealing feeling, stealing consciousness, stealing hope. The promise of the high ground was beginning to feel like a cruel mirage, a higher platform merely for a grander, more spectacular fall into the abyss below. The Faroe Islands, built of basalt and ancient geological strength, were shuddering now like a mortally wounded animal. The wind shrieked the language of pure, unadulterated chaos, and as they looked back, they could see the flames of the Big Darhus being finally extinguished, not by the sea, but by the total collapse of the cliff edge that had hosted it. The whole valley floor was definitively gone. They were truly alone now, suspended precariously between a crumbling sky and a ravenous ascending ocean. Racing against the terrifying moment, the mountain decided to become the next casualty. The mountain, Skalingsfjall, was not merely standing guard above the tiny, desperate cluster of Gotha. It was shuddering, a massive, ancient body caught in a death rattle, amplified by the relentless pressure of the storm. Below, the stone floor of the turf houses transmitted the tremors not just from the terrifying wind pressure, but from the deep, resonant shock waves of the ocean slamming into the hidden basalt columns beneath the village shelf, threatening to split the island foundation itself. The wind had ceased to be a fluid element. It was a physical weapon, solidifying into abrasive sheets of frozen mist and shattered granite dust, scouring the peat roofs and stripping the paint from the few wooden facades that dared face the primal cruelty of the East. The sound was the true, paralyzing terror, a sustained, high-frequency scream that wiped out the ability to reason, a frequency of pure, cosmic destruction that felt like it was tearing the very cilia inside the survivors' years and dissolving their sanity. They were deafened by the apocalypse, isolated inside their own skull cages, watching the world dissolve in a chaos of gray and blinding white. It was the sound of millions of tons of water being vaporized instantly, only to reform into sledgehammers of brine, ice, and pulverized stone, hammering relentlessly at the fragile human structures. Einar, the elder fisherman, a man whose spine was forged from the same uncompromising basalt as the cliffs, fought his way to the thick inner stone wall of his house, his eyes wide and bloodshot, not from fear, but from the grinding salt spray that coated his lashes like abrasive glass shards. He knew with the cold, absolute certainty of a man who had spent 70 years reading the Atlantic's moods, that this was no mere storm. This was the ocean deciding to reclaim, violently, the infinitesimal sliver of land it had momentarily permitted them to borrow. His wife, Ranwa, huddled deep within the central chamber with the 3 remaining children, clutching the precious fire-warmed stones they used for heat, a flickering, tangible defiance against the absolute, profound cold of the deep ocean that pressed in on them from all sides. The fire, the vital symbol of human persistence, was dwindling. The chimney choked instantly by downdraft and sudden malicious blasts of salty wind that stole the oxygen and replaced it with a suffocating, dense dampness that soaked the very air. Even the atmosphere was trying to drown them in its humidity. Their traditional hjalur, the vital wooden drying house, typically raised on sturdy stone pillars high above the encroaching damp, had vanished entirely hours ago, torn from its moorings and swallowed by the ascending sea. It had taken with it the crucial winter stores of skerpikjöt, semi-fermented lamb, and the entire season's worth of dried fish. Those supplies, their only lifeline against starvation, were now scattered across the unforgiving, frothing Atlantic, a sacrifice to the insatiable hunger of the deep. This wasn't just hunger. It was a fundamental, strategic erasure of their ability to survive the months to come, even if they survived the night. The Faroese settlements, built precariously upon layers of ancient fractured basalt, now faced a specific invisible geological threat: the skriðulopi, the sudden catastrophic landslide triggered by excessive water saturation and the ceaseless seismic pounding of the giant waves. They had always feared the wind tearing their homes apart from the roof down, but now the very ground beneath their feet was betraying them, dissolving under the onslaught of elemental forces. The water was finding pathways they never knew existed, surging not just over the cliff face, but flowing through the incredibly porous rock structure, bubbling up from the dirt floors inside the houses like the island was trying to vomit them out of its core. This subsurface infiltration was the silent, insidious killer, destabilizing the foundations of the incredibly heavy stone walls that had stood firm for generations against the whims of the sea. Einar witnessed the result at the neighboring house, not a spectacular, explosive collapse, but a slow, sickening tilt of overwhelming defeat. The entire structure, burdened by centuries of heavy peat roofing, simply began to lean into the wind, the dissolved mortar offering no resistance, the stones grinding against each other with a sound like a giant chewing gravel inside a massive mouth. It was agonizingly slow, then terrifyingly swift, reducing the home to a pile of wet, worthless rubble in the span of 3 rapid heartbeats, the occupants having miraculously fled into the storm just seconds before the total catastrophic failure. They were dependent on one tiny, terrifying light: the distant, powerful lighthouse on Nólsoy, visible only in the brief, nightmarish gaps between the storm's most violent, whipping squalls. It was a cruel, almost mocking reminder of civilization, a pinprick of defiant human engineering that seemed impossibly far away. Yet it was the only external constant they had left, a desperate prayer made tangible and visible through the tempest.
But even the Nolsoy light seemed to be losing its profound battle against the atmospheric density. The beam, usually a sharp, powerful slice through the darkness, appeared diffused, distorted, as if the air itself was too thick, too condensed with water vapor and finely pulverized rock dust to allow light to pass cleanly. It looked like a flickering, dying candle, struggling against a galactic breath, trying to snuff it out forever.
The true, immediate threat, however, was in the horrifying color of the ocean. It was no longer the familiar deep sapphire or slate gray of the North Atlantic they knew intimately. It was a churning, horrifying black-brown, rich with the silt, peat, and soil it had stripped violently from the upper reaches of the island slopes, miles away. They were witnessing the island being literally washed away, atom by atom, into the bottomless abyss, dissolving before their eyes. This was not merely geological erosion. This was the complete, violent disintegration of their home landscape. Every gargantuan wave that crashed back and receded brought with it not just brine and spray, but deep fragments of the very earth they walked on, a morbid, terrifying accounting of the land they were losing in real time. The community, though physically battered and mentally exhausted, clung desperately to the deep-seated Faroese leaves digged, the inherent toughness and primal resilience born of centuries spent battling this exact, uncompromising environment. They moved with a desperate, practiced efficiency. The men secured the remaining fishing gear, not because they expected to fish soon, but because losing the tools of their survival felt like admitting absolute defeat to the cosmos itself. They knew the histories passed down through the sagas. They knew of the great Holmgotan waves of the past, monstrous swells rumored to have lifted boulders the size of cows and deposited them impossibly far inland. But those were legends, warnings spoken around a warm hearth to frighten children. This was the terrifying, immediate reality of the legends coming alive, fueled by an unnatural, perhaps unprecedented atmospheric anomaly that amplified the wind speed far beyond anything ever recorded in the capital of Tórshavn. The wind suddenly, unnervingly, shifted direction, dropping not into silence, but into a deep, bone-vibrating rumble, the sound of 1,000 phantom freight trains passing deep underground, tearing up the rock. This brief, terrifying lull was infinitely worse than the preceding cacophony. It was the chilling, terrifying inhalation before the final, cosmic scream. Einar raised his hand, signaling absolute, desperate silence, trying to pierce the deafening ringing in his ears. He knew this pause in the wind. It meant the storm was repositioning for a final, lethal strike, gathering the accumulated mass of the Atlantic into one ultimate expression of geological contempt and fury. Through a tiny, broken pane of glass that survived the torrent, he looked out towards the churning black horizon. the sea had pulled back further than he had ever seen it in his lifetime, exposing slimy black rock shelf that normally lay hidden beneath the tide for decades. And on that exposed temporary shore, he saw the undeniable final truth. A mountainous, moving ridge of water, impossibly high, deeply dark, and crowned with a terrifying white fringe of deadly foam, moving towards them with the speed of a charging, unstoppable beast. It was the home Gotan made real. It was the end of everything they knew. He turned back to his family huddled in the dark. The silent, terrible knowledge reflected in his eyes. They had survived the relentless wind, but they would not survive the wall of crushing water that was now preparing to deliver the final, absolute judgment of the cold ocean night. The judgment was delivered not as a gentle washing, but as a colossal, non-negotiable fist forged from 1 billion tons of frozen fury. The sound was beyond hearing. It was a physical shockwave that vibrated through the very bedrock of the islands, silencing the wind for one horrifying fraction of a second, replacing it with the sound of the world ending. Old Olav's eyes, fixed on the monstrous liquid cliff, widened in a silent scream that never reached his lips before the Atlantic swallowed the light entirely. The wave was not merely water. It was kinetic energy weaponized, carrying within its black heart the debris of the shoreline, the entire winter's supply of drift logs and stones ripped violently from the cliff face. It struck the cluster of turf-roofed houses like a hydraulic press, flattening centuries of tradition and toil in one instantaneous, unforgiving stroke. The settlement of Midvagur, which had stood sentinel against the relentless forces of the north for generations, was suddenly nothing more than kindling and cold mud, tossed contemptuously into the churning maw of the sea. The sheer shock of the 2 degrees Celsius water was a biological weapon, paralyzing muscles and stealing breath faster than any physical injury or the deepest wound. Young Ellen, shielded momentarily by the collapse of the fishing shed's heavy roof beams, found herself submerged in a terrifying, freezing slurry of salt and collapsing architecture, tossed like a broken doll in a concrete mixer. She clawed upward, her lungs burning with the desperate, agonizing need for air. The instinct for life, a primordial engine driving her through the swirling, razor-sharp debris field. The depth was deceptive. The wave had carried the water far inland, transforming the main street into a vicious, turbulent, temporary river, attempting to drag everything back out to the crushing, waiting depths of the deep-sea trenches. She tasted blood and salt, her fingers scraping uselessly against the slick, moss-covered stone foundations that were all that remained of her neighbor's once sturdy home, praying for purchase, for solid ground that no longer existed. Above the tremendous, agonizing roar of the receding tide, which was equally destructive, pulling entire sections of wall and roof structure out to the deep sea, she heard a muffled, ragged, agonizing cry. It was not Olav, who was surely gone, swallowed by the first, absolute impact, but the deep, hacking cough of her father, Paul, who must have somehow survived the initial blast inside the deep, thick, stone-built storage cellar, their final, desperate refuge. The storage cellar, built deep into the earth and reinforced with the densest basalt available to the ancient builders, was the only structure that hadn't been instantly vaporized upon impact. But even this fortress groaned under the impossible strain. The thick wooden door, meant to keep out rats and the winter chill, was twisted inward, hopelessly jammed by a colossal, smooth boulder the size of a dairy cow that the wave had deposited squarely, perfectly against the entrance, sealing him inside. Pal was trapped, buried alive in his own supposed sanctuary, the rapidly rising water level inside the cellar ensuring that his survival window was now measured in mere minutes, not the hours that hypothermia usually granted. Ellen scrambled toward the rubble, her body already going numb, the cold having already begun its systematic, chilling shutdown of her core functions, demanding surrender. She saw the faint, defiant light of their oil lamp flickering weakly through a crack in the cellar wall, a precious, rebellious ember of civilization refusing to be extinguished by the overwhelming flood and the absolute dark. The smell of stored, heavily salted mutton and damp wool was suddenly mixed with the terrifying, invasive scent of raw sea wire invading the sacred earth. The boulder was immense, impossible to shift, even for two strong, full-grown Faroese men, let alone a half-drowned young woman shivering violently in the dark, fighting against the current. But the Faroese people are not defined by possibility. They are defined entirely by necessity, by a terrifying, unrelenting will to endure. Her muscles, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of pure, raw adrenaline and the primal, burning love for her father, suddenly found strength where all logic dictated only weakness, only failure. She didn't lift it. She viciously, desperately wrestled with it, grunting against the cold, smooth face of the rock, pushing with her shoulder and driving her feet into the slippery cobblestones beneath the surging, freezing water, her tendons screaming. Each millimeter of movement was a victory wrested directly from the icy, crushing grip of death himself. A moment of divine defiance against the ocean's absolute sovereignty. The pain was irrelevant. The cold was a distant, secondary memory. There was only the stone, the crushing, overwhelming weight, and the sound of her father's labored, shallow breathing, becoming more and more distant, more and more shallow, behind the barrier. She was the fire now, burning fiercely and absolutely against the wind and the stone, refusing to yield to the relentless, cold ocean's decree, refusing to let him go. With a horrific, grinding screech that sounded like the island itself was tearing viciously apart, the boulder shifted just enough to allow access, perhaps 6 inches of desperate passage. Ellen squeezed through the narrow gap, the breath of life and the reunion. Paul lay hunched over a submerged barrel, coughing rhythmically, his leg clearly broken and twisted at an unnatural, terrifying angle. But his eyes were alive, a brief, burning confirmation of their impossible survival against all odds. "The cliffs," he wheezed,
pointing with a trembling, desperate hand toward the high ground, the ancient sheep paths carved precariously into the sheer basalt face. "We must reach the highland, child. The sea is coming back for us." He knew the terrible, unforgiving cadence of the ocean, the horrible secret that even this colossal first wave was often just the massive, terrifying inhalation before the storm delivered its truly final, devastating, absolute exhale. They had escaped the drowning only to face the inevitable second, even more massive, tidal onslaught that was now gathering its malevolent forces just offshore, shimmering ominously under the brief, mocking glimpse of the moon through the clouds. The entire structure of the cellar was now compromised, water pouring in from dozens of newly ruptured seams and cracks, turning their only haven into a rapidly filling underwater death trap. They had to move. Now. But how does a woman carry an injured man up a treacherous, rubble-strewn cliff face, with the wrath of the entire Atlantic roaring up immediately behind them, demanding its due? Paul, despite the searing, blinding agony in his leg, understood the calculus of survival better than anyone. He gripped Ellen's shoulder, his eyes wide with a terrifying clarity that cut through the pain and the dark. "The rope," he gasped, his voice thin but urgent. "The old climbing rope, kept in the iron chest beneath the hearthstone. It survived the impact." The hearthstone, miraculously, was still standing, a lone, stubborn sentinel amidst the total, absolute devastation of the village. It was a physical symbol of their home's core, now their only mechanical hope. Ellen plunged back out into the freezing, swirling currents, the retrieval of the heavy, brine-soaked rope representing the single most vital, terrifying fetch quest in the history of this isolated, doomed community. She dragged the ancient, thick hemp, heavy with salt and the stench of fish oil and brine, back to Paul. It was their only tool against the sheer, unforgiving height of the basalt cliffs, which were now looming above them like terrifying judges, prepared to witness their ultimate failure. The treacherous ground they now stood upon was not earth, but a pulverized mosaic of their former lives. Shards of pottery, splintered boat ribs, and the sodden, heavy remnants of wool blankets, all acting as slick, deadly obstacles under the freezing, surging water. The goat paths, usually narrow but navigable, had been partially washed away by the runoff, leaving sheer, terrifying drops where steady steps used to be. As Ellen began to thread the rope around Paul's torso, preparing to haul him upward through sheer, agonizing willpower and impossible effort, the ground trembled again, deeper this time. It was the deep, unsettling rumble of the earth reacting to the immense, catastrophic shift in pressure. The battle for Mithvagor was far from over. It had simply shifted from horizontal demolition to a vertical desperation climb against the very laws of physics and the relentless, crushing gravity of the churning sea. They had escaped the teeth of the colossal, churning wave, but in their desperate, vertical scramble, they had climbed straight into the lungs of the storm. And the air here was not air. It was liquid nitrogen flung from the mouth of a vengeful frost giant. Every desperate gasp seized the chest,
turning the moisture in their lungs to tiny, razor-sharp shards of ice that tore at their breath. This was the precise moment the North Atlantic stopped being merely water and became a weapon of thermodynamic annihilation, stripping body heat faster than any natural process should allow, faster than the remnants of the Mikyal House fire could ever have generated it. The altitude offered zero reprieve from the gale. It merely traded the horizontal demolition of the waves for the surgical cruelty of the wind and the relentless, deep cold, a bone-aching menace that promised a slower, more insidious death than drowning.
The meager, moss-covered turf of the higher slopes of the fjall offered virtually no shelter, only slightly less precarious footing than the salt-slicked basalt rocks below, now freezing solid in the sudden, unbelievable temperature drop following the storm's core passage. They huddled behind ancient, crumbling stone walls, dry-stacked millennia ago by ancestral shepherds, walls meant to keep stray sheep in, not the unmitigated fury of the cosmos out. The stone itself vibrated, humming a low, terrifying frequency that spoke of immense, unstoppable kinetic energy passing through the bedrock itself, indicating the sheer, unbelievable pressure being exerted on the island mass.
Old man Jakub, who had sailed the turbulent fjords and channels his entire 80 years and knew the temperament of the sea like his own palm, swore he saw the high watermark of the foam cresting above the height of the old church tower, a height previously reserved only for the highest, fastest-moving summer clouds. It was an impossibility that defied every navigational chart and every known law of hydrodynamics. Yet there it stood, or rather there it had stood, a colossal, churning gray wall that proved the ocean had simply decided to temporarily ignore the binding limitations of gravity and physics. The sheer, unfathomable volume of water missing from the immediate coastline below Miðvágur suggested a terrifying vacuum had been created, a dark promise that an even greater, secondary rebound wave, pulled back by the Earth's own desperate attempt to rebalance, was inevitable and perhaps even larger than the first. They were standing on a desperate narrow shelf of high ground, watching the world below being systematically disassembled into constituent atoms, waiting for the inevitable, final, highest surge to reach them. In this deep, brutal isolation of 1930, there was no chance of a radio distress call being transmitted, no powerful Coast Guard cutter waiting beyond the immediate horizon to render aid, and certainly no aircraft capable of flying into such unimaginable turbulence. There was only the static, deafening hiss of the universe utterly ignoring them, drowning out their silent, desperate prayers and the pathetic cries of the few remaining livestock. Their only connection to the outside world, a few fragile, highly exposed copper telegraph lines running perilously over the mountain passes, had been snapped hours ago, twisted into useless singing wires by the sheer force of the screaming gale, leaving them completely sealed off, a secret tragedy unfolding beneath a black, unforgiving sky. Miðvágur was now a forgotten cork bobbing aimlessly in the primordial soup, its inhabitants witnessing the end of their familiar world. The wind, having spectacularly failed to sweep them away horizontally, and having failed to drown them vertically, began its third insidious attack, the artillery barrage. Small, heavy stones and large, jagged chunks of rock, ripped violently from the exposed cliffs far above the settlement, were hurled downward with the lethal velocity of powerful musket balls. The sound was a constant, terrifying, metallic ping, ping, ping as the projectiles struck the remaining, battered stone foundations and bounced violently off the higher rock faces where they were huddled. Suddenly, a sound infinitely worse and far deeper than the wind's shriek resonated through the bedrock. The deep, sickening groan of the earth itself, protesting under the unimaginable duress. The saturated ground, undermined by the constant torrent of rain and the seismic, relentless pounding of the catastrophic waves, began to slip laterally and vertically. The sheer weight of the waterlogged peat and the loose basalt rock above their heads, which had soaked up the deluge for days, finally reached critical mass, initiating a slow, deadly cascade of scree and earth. They were catastrophically caught between the crushing, liquid threat of the sea below and the terrifying realization that the mountain they had sought refuge on was now actively trying to violently shake them off its shoulders, seeking its own temporary stability. Young Ellen, barely 18 years old, but possessing the hardened instincts of a true islander, saw the initial slippage first, a terrifying river of mud and shale beginning its descent just yards away. She didn't scream or panic. She simply acted, shoving 3 younger children deeper into the only narrow crevice beneath a massive, immovable, ancient basalt overhang, a natural cave formation known locally as the Raven's Mouth. The others followed instantly, scrambling and jamming themselves into the tight space, trading the wide, horizontal danger of the wind's immediate force for the vertical squeeze of potential burial and structural collapse. This confined space, reeking intensely of damp moss, terrified sheep and human fear, immediately became their final, desperate redoubt against the twin terrors of the brutal, penetrating cold and the imminent mountain collapse. The claustrophobia was instant and terrifying, the smell palpable, but the immediate, blessed cessation of the wind's full, ripping force felt like a temporary, precious reprieve, a moment to reset the lungs. They were no longer fighting the air above them. They were fighting the stones surrounding and above them, listening in cramped, agonized silence as the mountain began to violently digest itself, the stones grinding like hungry teeth. But even in that cramped, momentary darkness, the bitter, relentless cold penetrated, chilling them to the very marrow, reminding them that the storm had many weapons left to deploy. They understood then that the Hjalur was not a sanctuary, but a tomb of temporary respite, chilling them slowly, deliberately, like a predator playing with its prey. The wind had ceased its direct frontal assault, only to begin a siege of attrition, drawing the heat from their clustered bodies with emergency. The air inside the tight space grew brittle, every breath a shallow, painful inhalation of frozen misery,
metallic and sharp on the throat.
This was not just weather. This was a geological event dressed in ice, designed to test the limits of human endurance against the raw, unadulterated hostility of the North Atlantic winter. Their hands, already numb, started to ache with a deep, bone-grinding pain, a warning signal that the dreaded hypothermia, the quiet killer, had officially joined the battle. The temperature was dropping precipitously, driven lower not only by the ambient cold, but by the constant infiltration of aerosolized seawater that wicked the warmth directly from their saturated woolens. They huddled tighter, a single shivering knot of humanity, fighting a losing war against the vast, consuming chill, knowing that if they stayed here, the stone walls that shielded them from the wind would soon become the icebox that sealed their doom. They prayed for dawn, but the night felt like 1,000 years of endless, frozen blackness, and the sounds of the storm were changing, becoming more dangerous. Then came the sound that chilled them far deeper than the wind's icy breath, the unsettling, low-frequency groan of stone being moved against its will. The foundation of the Hjallur, traditionally dry-stacked to withstand minor shifts, but never this primordial fury, began to tremble violently. It wasn't the rhythmic pounding of the waves they were accustomed to. It was a constant, high-frequency vibration that signaled structural fatigue, the stone itself giving up the ghost. A thin line of mortarless stone, high up near the small turf roof gap, finally gave way under the relentless pressure from the landward side, where the wind acted as a colossal hydraulic press. A single, fist-sized chunk of basalt rocketed inward, striking the stone floor with the force of a gunshot, sending up a fine, choking dust cloud, the first clear sign that their shelter was failing catastrophically. This rupture was the final, undeniable alarm. Jakub, the elder fisherman, whose face was carved by decades of salt and sorrow, felt the shifting beneath his boots and knew the verdict was sealed. They had mere minutes before the entire roof assembly, heavy with sod and saturated earth, would crush them into the stone floor, silent and forgotten. Survival demanded the impossible, leaving the only cover they possessed and re-entering the screaming inferno of wind, stone, and fire. It was a desperate, burning calculation, a choice between certain, slow death by crushing and the slim, terrifying chance of instantaneous, brutal death by exposure. "We move," Jakub rasped, the sound barely audible over the relentless cacophony. "The church, higher ground, now." The very idea was insane. Stepping outside was equivalent to throwing oneself into the ocean's maw. But the collapse of the Hjallur was no longer a possibility. It was an imminent certainty, a countdown measured in the grinding shift of basalt. They unbolted the heavy wooden door, braced internally with fishing rope, and as they did, the storm did not just rush in, it exploded inward, a hyperbaric shockwave of freezing brine and gravel. The pressure differential was so extreme that 2 of the younger women were immediately thrown back against the wall, stunned by the sheer violence of the atmosphere. Jakub threw himself out first,
anchoring his weight against the ground and screaming for the others to follow, using the last vestiges of the Hjalar structure as temporary windbreak against the terrifying momentum of the wind.
The ground itself seemed to move, vibrating under the sheer force of the wind's velocity. But worse still was the unseen, hypersonic shrapnel flying past their ears. The storm was now systematically dismantling the remnants of the village, turning every loose piece of roofing slate, every discarded fishbone, and every stray pebble into lethal projectiles, traveling faster than a hurled spear.
One man, Christian, stumbled, his ankle giving way on the treacherous slope, and before he could fully register the pain, a piece of sharp volcanic stone, torn from a distant wall, sliced across his cheek, drawing a line of hot, immediate blood that instantly froze against his skin, sealing the wound with a crust of ice. They pressed themselves low, crawling when walking became impossible, tasting nothing but salt and grit, and the primal fear that tasted like rust and ozone. Each inch gained was a victory against physics, a defiance of the natural order that demanded they simply lie down and let the elements claim them. The church, built in the 18th century, with thick walls designed to withstand centuries of this exact environment, rose ahead of them, a black, hulking silhouette, promising salvation, yet still seeming impossibly far through the chaos. Finally, Jakub and the two strongest remaining men reached the massive oak door of the church. This door was their last defense, a barrier against the elemental rage that had just consumed their homes and their livelihoods. But the problem wasn't getting in. The problem was fighting the hurricane force that was actively pressing the door closed from the outside, turning the simple act of pulling the latch into a feat of superhuman strength. They threw their combined weight against the ancient timber, their muscles screaming, their lungs burning from the cold and the exertion, knowing that failure meant being swept back out into the killing dark. The storm shrieked around the frame, trying to rip the door off its iron hinges, threatening to use the small aperture as a funnel to blow the entire interior out the other side. With a final, desperate heave, fueled by the adrenaline of sheer survival, they managed to pry the door inward just enough to slip through, one by one, dragging the injured and the weak behind them. The last man through slammed the heavy latch home, dropping the massive iron bar across the timber, plunging them into the total, absolute darkness of the sanctuary. The abrupt silence, the sudden cessation of the wind's noise, was perhaps the most shocking sensory experience of the entire ordeal, a ringing, deafening quiet that felt artificial and temporary, leaving them gasping, drenched, and profoundly alone in the heart of stone. But the storm was still outside, and it was still watching, patiently waiting for any weakness in the stone to appear.